everyone, welcome to our webinar today, Ultimate Logic Apps Best Practices Guide, and this part is part 3, Mastering Security. So let me just highlight the fact that please feel free to post questions and comments, and we'll get to those at the end, or either myself or my colleagues will follow up online. In terms of who we're aiming at today, we're talking about security in Azure, but we are really, you don't have to be deep hands-on techie for this one today. It's a bit more about understanding the concepts of security, and it's really relevant for everyone from technical decision makers all the way through to developers. So if you are, at all involved in planning, designing, or building integration solutions in Azure, then this is definitely for you one of the most important topics you could possibly be involved in. This is part of a series. This is the third installment. We've already covered performance, we've covered operations, we're now looking at security, and in the future we'll look at DevOps and deployment, and we'll also look at FinOps and costings. But for today, we are going to look at this. So we're going to do introductions in a second. We're going to look at the problem space as it pertains to security. We're going to really delve in to the best practices. We're going to do some demo, and then hopefully at the end we'll have a bit of time for Q&A. So also, please, scan this QR code with your phone and get ready to join in, because we are on Slido and we've got a couple of live polls. It'd be really great to get you involved in that and to understand where everyone on the call is coming from. So whether you're on StreamYard or whether you're on LinkedIn, you can still all participate using the Slido code here. So just give you a second to scan that. There will be more opportunities to join that when we actually get to the polls. So please, get involved. It's really help us to understand where you are at. Okay, so today, introductions. I've got with me Dave Phelps, who's a senior cloud solution architect with Microsoft in the UK, and is the go-to guy for integration. So anything that, there is nothing Dave doesn't know. And I am Andrew, and I'm a founder of 345 Technology, and we are a Microsoft partner specializing in integration. I'm just going to do a little couple of notices really for that. So one of the, if you want secure landing zones to run Azure integration services, then you can accelerate your next project with our product 345 Air. So a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today are baked into this. So if you want to build on Azure, then talk to me about that. Feel free to get in touch. But also, if you're still stuck on a legacy technology such as BizTalk, first thing you need to do is to understand what it is that needs to go in your plan to migrate. So get all the info you need in 1 week by booking a migration assessment. So BizTalk to Azure migration, talk to me, and we can help you get your plan together. Right, I'm going to talk a little bit about the problem space. So firstly, here's the first poll. So if you are, if you're building on Azure and you're interested in, in security, then whereabouts are you on the scale now of knowing whether you're confident in your security or whether you're not so sure, need to improve? Please, let's just sort of get a feel for how everyone feels on this one, because it'd be really important for us to sort of know where you're at. I'm glad no one's in the bottom category at the moment, but we'll see where everyone. Be interesting to see where you are by the end of this, because hopefully by the end of this your confidence levels will have gone up, because you know what the best practices are. So I'll just give everyone a few more seconds, another 10-15 seconds to do this, and sort of say. So I'm really glad that so many of you are quite confident, and quite confident plus extremely confident, definitely the majority. So hopefully after this you'll get some you'll get some extra pointers, and we can right, good stuff. So thanks a lot for that. I'm glad you're confident. Let's delve into this then. So why is security important? I mean, it's almost it almost goes without saying that security is top priority. And one of the things that we talk about is the CIA model, which is just an acronym that everyone can remember. So it's really, and that's about making sure confidential data remains confidential. That it doesn't get intercepted at rest, and it doesn't get intercepted in transit. The integrity of that data is ensured, so no one's tampering with it. It doesn't get corrupted. It doesn't get deleted. And then the availability of your systems and data, so that so you don't get denial of service. You've got reliability. You've got failover. So these are some of the things that you need to be thinking about for anything in your organization that's handling data. And integration is no different. And so, just a few factors for success. I mean, I'm not going to go into chapter and verse on this, but there's the shared responsibility model. So in any cloud provider gives you the tools with which you can make secure solutions, but they'll keep the hardware and the basic infrastructure secure, but you have to keep your application secure. So understand what's your responsibility as part of that shared responsibility model. You need to maintain a strong perimeter. That's true. We always know you've got to maintain your firewalls. You've got to maintain that external perimeter. That's important, but also look at your strength and depth. Make sure that you've got multiple layers of defense. Understand your attack surface, minimize it, but also remember that, as is always the case, the weakest link is between the screen, or between the keyboard and the chair, as we say. So just understand that human factors are actually the easiest attack vector, and that we'll touch on this a little bit later about some of the things that you can do, but understand that no matter what we put in from a systems perspective, that actually it's the human element you've got to think about as well. Okay, right, let's dive straight in then. So the first thing I'm just going to cover off, and I'm going to cover this off really quickly, and then, because this is sort of some essential information to understand some of the rest of it. So when we look at logic apps, we've got different ways of hosting them. So you've got consumption plans, but consumption is multi-tenant, and so it's on a shared hosting. And because it's on a shared compute, that compute is on its own network outside of your network, and so you just need to understand that consumption is outside your network. Logic App standard plans, though, they're on dedicated compute, and so you can put that compute into your own network. And also, there's app service environments have also got dedicated compute, but it's a slightly different hosting model. So there's a bit more flexibility there, but it doesn't work for everyone. And we sort of find that at least 80% of the time, the standard plan is kind of what suits people the best. But if we move on to the next slide with sort of the pros and cons of each of those, why would you use consumption? I mean, really, you don't have any, you just pay per execution. So it can be very cheap. If you've just got some things that, don't need to run in your network, and just need to trigger off now and again, that can be very cheap. But you can't, you've got less control over that. It's not on your own network. Standard plan on your network, but what you can find is if you've got a lot of standard plans, each of those then gets its own subnet, and then you actually have a lot of sprawl on that. There is a link on here to a new feature that's going to help with that, but it's only, I think, in private preview at the moment. And then app service environments, again, they're also in private dedicated space, but they can appear. Everything that's in an app service environment can be on the same subnet. So you've got so you've got that network simplicity, but it's potentially more expensive, and the deployment model is different. Dave, do you have any more thoughts on that before we move on?
finding the unmute button. Yeah, I guess the only thing I'd add there is that the preview that's listed there is about allowing there's a restriction currently with app service where a VNet and a single subnet can only be attached to one plan. So if you have multiple plans, then you have to have multiple subnets. So that may not necessarily be an issue, but if you wanted to use the same subnet across multiple plans, then you wouldn't be able to do that. And that's one of the reasons why we see people go for the app service environment, because it has that flexibility. But now with that preview, the reasons for one of the reasons for moving to ASE is being removed. So it's worth bearing that in mind. I've certainly seen a few customers that have used ASEs specifically for that purpose, because if you have a lot of plans, that could be a lot of subnets, which of course you have to manage.
Yeah, no, that's really good point. Okay, so what? So that's really some foundational thing, because a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is really going to fall under the bottom two categories, and probably we're biased a bit more towards standard plan. But really, from this point onwards, very little that we talk about is really going to be aimed at consumption, because a lot of what we're going to be talking about is really how you secure things and how you secure connections into your own network. So, so in terms of securing logic apps, I mean, even when you've got a VNet, and that VNet can be peered into your own environment, a logic app by default has a public endpoint unless you enable the private link on it. So just some things to look out for on this is, obviously, it's really good to put your logic app inside a private VNet. When you use private link, the traffic then goes private, because ultimately the traffic can be routed over the internet unless you force it to be private, which in most cases that isn't what you want. There's also additional layers. I talked about the strength and depth, so you can use your identity and access manager to control access to your logic apps. You can also make sure that you can only have access from certain IP addresses. So it's not just your network in itself, but you can build up these layers of defense so that you've got as minimal vectors of attack as possible. And then also you can use APIM to control any of your logic apps that are being accessed via HTTP. So, Dave, do you have any particular thoughts or anything else that needs to be sort of highlighted on any of those points?
I think you've covered it all. All I'd say is that the best practices here are typically what we see from the customers really demand, especially enterprise customers, where they may have their own internal restrictions where they don't want any public IP addresses, and that means that the logic app would have to connect privately, to different services, etc. So, that's all good.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why, I mean, going back onto the shameless plug of 345 Air, but one of the reasons why we created that is that actually wiring up, for a lot of people, wiring up all this, the private VNets and private link is actually quite hard. So we definitely wanted to have an infrastructure footprint where we could roll this out by default. So it's because we often find that sort of the developer skill set, is often geared to the functionality and adding the business value from that, rather than the network kind of skill set. So it's useful to know that you need these kind of skill sets together in order to get a lot of the security stuff done. But you can also just deploy your hosting plans, get all the private links set up, and then you're actually in quite a good place to just let the developers do their thing. Okay, so when we're talking about back office services, so if you want to connect to other applications, particularly if you've got them on premises or even in other parts of your cloud environment, or if you want to access databases or APIs, then you've got to actually have a network route to them. And so actually, this is why it's important to consider that consumption versus, standard plan. Because if consumption's outside your network, they're not going to be able to, by default, talk through into your back office systems directly. There is, but also connectors come in two flavors. There's managed connectors and in-app connectors. Now, Logic App Standard run on your dedicated compute, so in-app runs in that process within that compute, whereas a managed connector, and we talked about this in the performance webinar, but a managed connector is actually hosted by Microsoft, but it's hosted on shared compute. So again, a managed connector is outside your network. So there we are. So in other words, if you want to connect directly to your backend processes, then you've got in-app connectors, but also, and this is a big topic, but when you do your whole landing zone, what we call the platform landing zone, where you're configuring your express routes or express routes if you're in America, and how you and your hub and spoke model and how you peer your networks, then there's you just need to think about that. So when we're creating the VNets for Logic Apps, that really is a spoke in your hub and spoke model. And that should, and then if you've actually set up your landing zone right, your security governance can really control which network can talk to which one and what traffic's allowed through those. So that's a big topic in itself. But getting that right up front makes everything else a lot easier downstream. Again, Dave, do you have any other thoughts on that one, other than it's a big topic and we could spend a whole hour on that in itself?
Yeah, we could. But I guess the point about the managed connectors versus the in-app is a really important one. And it's really important to select the right connector when you're building your Logic app, because the ones, as Andrew said, the ones that the in-app ones, they run within the Logic app process, so they can talk over the virtual network to your private resources. And we have a whole bunch of built-in connectors like Service Bus, for example, or SQL, Cosmos DB, Azure Storage. I forget how many there are, but there are quite a few, and they tend to be the resources that you may have on premises or that you would be deploying as a service into Azure, and would therefore want it to be on a private endpoint. And the other thing I'll add is that the built-in connectors or in-app, they don't have any throttling limits on them at all. Mm-hmm. So they will just scale with your Logic app, assuming the back end can scale, of course.
Yeah, so according to however you've set your auto scale rules or whatever, that they'll just scale up with that. Okay, so then if we look at perimeter security, again, we've talked about the fact that Logic apps have either a public endpoint or private endpoint, but those by default those are available on the internet. But what we can do is not only can we use API management to actually provide access to those as an API through an API governance layer, but also you can use either application gateway or Azure Front Door to implement a web application firewall to ensure that actually the traffic going into that endpoint is actually adequately protected. Now, again, when we're talking with customers about this, and we typically put API management in as part of the core integration layer, because that's like one of the big foundations that we see as of the integration technology stack. But how our customers want to do their firewall kind of varies, because some of them have a specific firewall that they've implemented, or they want or that's part of their platform landing zone, and then they're just going to route that through, and whereas others kind of want the firewall specifically on their integration stuff. So there is some flexibility about how you actually configure that perimeter, but generally very good practice to have to ensure you've got those layers of protection. Is there anything else really that needs to go into that mix, Dave? I mean, we've got here about Defender and monitoring that, but what other things are good to add into there?
Yeah, I think it's worth just calling out a couple of differences between App Gateway and Front Door. So Application Gateway is a regional service, whereas Azure Front Door is a global service. So if you have multi-region deployments and you might be using API management, for example, then having Application Gateway would be just for that one specific region. Whereas if you're using Front Door, then that can load balance across multi-regions. So of course, with Application Gateway, you can put that in front of APIM across multi-regions and use Traffic Manager in front of that, which is perfectly valid use case. And Defender for APIs, I don't know if people have been looking at this, but it's really good, and it does monitor your public endpoints and API management specifically, giving some real-time details on what's happening regarding possible attacks, etc. So definitely worth taking a look.
Yeah, and again, just looking back to some of the customer work we've done. I mean, we've done both Front Door and Traffic Manager in various scenarios, because if you want an integration solution that's got cross region high availability, if you want active, then that's where, again, Front Door is probably what you want. So because Front Door is sort of, I say, it's global, always available, and can route to different regions. Whereas if you actually just want one region to fail over to another, then you can still achieve that with Traffic Manager, because you can just repoint Traffic Manager in your new region. But that's more if you've got an active passive. It kind of works for that as well. So definitely some options there. But obviously, Traffic Manager is a much simpler service than having Front Door. So again, there's lots of options there, and it depends on what your requirement is as to which one is the best way to go. Okay, so we'll also talk about the data and the storage. So, I mean, one of the things we talked about when we did the performance webinar, we talked quite a lot about the fact that behind every logic app, particularly if it's a stateful logic app, you've got a storage account, and the execution state, the run history is getting written there. And so we actually do have quite a reliance on the storage accounts. And by default, that just writes into that storage account, and whoever's got access to that storage account can read that data. But also when you actually go as an operator, you can then look at the run history of logic apps, and you can see everything that goes through in the execution. So you can see the message that's been received. So, if you've got sensitive data, then you need to actually, you need to pay some attention to here as to who can see what. So, in terms of best practices, I'm just going to highlight these and then let me just go back. So, Dave, do you want to just talk a little bit about the storage and the run history and the sensitive fields and how that all hangs together?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so the storage account is where the run history is stored, and by default it is a public storage account. But as has been said, you obviously need to attach your logic app to a virtual network. Then you can take that storage account, enable private link, and then that's not then viewable publicly. You need to bear in mind, if you're going to do that, though, that you as the person wanting to view the history has to be on the same network in order to view that. So important point for people who are kind of developing logic apps, etc., where they want to see those contents. And also within actions in logic apps, you can specify that you don't want the action input or output to be written into the run history. So if there's something sensitive there, you can get that excluded. And of course, if you use application insights for your end-to-end monitoring, then maybe there's less of a need to be using the run history if you're capturing the right data.
Yeah, and there's also a kind of a wider thing here with with things like PII data and financial data and that sort of thing, in that not just your logic apps, but also things like Service Bus. That if you're putting these messages onto Service Bus, then an operator who's got access to Service Bus can be viewing these things as well. So just have a think about the life cycle of where a message goes to, and if that message is very sensitive, then there's various various design patterns you can do. You can do a claim check pattern where you actually store the message somewhere secure and then just pass a pointer to that message, so that you don't. So throughout your messaging infrastructure and your run history, you don't actually have the message itself, but you just have a pointer to it. So just be aware that message can have various people viewing it, unless you actually take some precautions on that one. Okay, and then let's just talk a little bit about managed identities. And again, I think just because my voice is getting tired now, but I'll let you just go through this a little bit, Dave, and talk through some of the stuff on managed identities.
Sure. Yeah, I seem to have got a thread going on as well somewhere. Yeah, I think we see this all the time, don't we, with different services that may need a SAS key in order to call them, meaning there's some kind of token well, not a token, but some kind of signature that gets appended to a query string to grant access to your resource, whether that could be through a logic app by default that has a SAS token on the URL, or it could be a storage account that has a SAS token as well. So if one service wants to call another service protected using a SAS token, it needs to have those kind of security details stored locally. And what it also means is that if I take that URL that contains that SAS token, I could take it outside of my organization and I could call that from anywhere I like. Of course, the networking that we've spoken about will alleviate that by restricting access to your organization. But if we use managed identity, that means that the client is able to connect to that resource without needing any kind of SAS token or anything like that. It just connects to the endpoint. And under the hood, managed identity is talking to Azure AD to go and get a token, to then pass that token to the back end, which is then validated that you have the access to that resource that has been granted to you. So it's great in so many ways, because you don't have to manage those internal tokens, which of course is such an important thing. And the other thing is that the token that you receive has a lifetime, so it will expire. So even if somebody were to copy that token, then it won't be valid for very long. And most of these services in Azure support managed identity, including logic apps, functions, API management, etc. So definitely would recommend using managed identity wherever you can.
Yeah, because it just means that it's just back to sort of taking an approach thing that's secure by default, isn't it? And just making sure that once you've secured your perimeter, like you say with OAuth or whatever, that everything else is actually you're relying on the built-in security and just using the identity and access management within Azure to do that. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to jump over and do a bit of a demo of some of this stuff. So hopefully, Dave, you're able to share that, and then we'll move on to. So I'll give you a. Well, whilst we're getting that ready, we can just hop onto this and then okay. So
Cool. Can you see my
yeah,
screen?
talk us through it. Yeah, that's come through.
Okay, so I know that we're talking about logic apps here primarily, but we so often see API management sat in front of logic apps that this demo begins its journey in API management. And what I have here is I have an API in API management, and it is protected using Azure AD, Microsoft Entra ID. So in order to call that API, we need to go off to Entra ID to get a token. We then need to pass that token through to API management in a header. Then API management is going to validate that token and check that I have the access that I say that I do. And what it will then do is call my logic app, which is the backend to API management. But that logic app, it too is protected using Microsoft Entra ID. So in order to be able to call my logic app, I need to be able to fetch a token. First of all, that would be granted access, but also fetch a token and then pass that token through to my logic app. Then the logic app itself talks to Service Bus, and it can do that in two ways. It could do it using the SAS token that you can configure with Service Bus, or it can use managed identity. So I've enabled it can use Azure AD, but I've enabled managed identity in in API management to kind of make that, to go and get that token and then call the logic app on the back end. So I'm just going to show you quickly what this looks like. So in API management, I have this validate JWT token and policy. And the important thing to look at here is the audience and the role. And so what I've done is my client that is calling this API, it has an app registration in Azure AD, and I've granted it permission to the app registration that is represented within APIM. And if I can successfully get a token, these values will be present in my token, and then they'll be checked. And if these aren't here, this will get thrown out. So I won't kind of delve into the details of how I set all that up, but I've got a blog actually. I'll share a link, and you can see how to do some of this stuff. And then if I scroll down here, then we have this line, authenticate managed identity. And this is telling API management that in order to access this resource here, which happens to be my logic app, to use this user assigned managed identity value here to go and fetch a token, it automatically appends it to the authorization header in the request. Then it goes and hits my logic app here. Now you can see that my logic app doesn't have the usual signature or the SAS token that you would normally have on the end of the logic app. I've removed that because I'm only using, excuse me, I'm only using Azure AD in order to authorize my logic app. And I'll just show this working just to prove it does work. So the first thing I'm going to do is get a token. I'm then going to make a call, and hopefully that will succeed with a 200 OK. So that shows that the end-to-end authorization that has happened from this client, Postman, to API management to the logic app to Service Bus has succeeded. So what does this look like inside logic apps? So here's my logic app, and there's a feature of app service of which logic apps is based. It's based on function apps, and function apps are based on app service. But there's this feature here called Easy Auth, and this has not been around in the portal that long in Logic Apps. It's only been fairly recently added. But you can configure that here, or you can do it through Bicep, or whatever is your favorite method of deployment is. But you can configure this in your CI/CD pipeline. But if I click Edit here, again, the important thing is this audience value here. So in order for my request to be authorized, the token has to have this audience present. I can also specify down here a list of clients that I'm allowing into my application. Just looking at time. So these are the clients that I'm authorizing into my app. Now, there are really two ways of doing this. We can authorize it this way by specifying the client IDs of the clients, or we can assign roles. And we're not going to go into that here. It's a kind of wider topic. But what you can do is, as I did in APIM, you can create roles in your application registration and then assign a client access to that role. And then that role is present in the JWT token that you can then validate. And you could do that inside the Logic app. You could do it if you're using a function app, and APIM has that validate JWT policy that does that for you. So then if we just go back to my Logic app here, and I go to my workflow, we can see here that I've got when the designer comes up. So here we've got a bunch of actions. Now this one is a call through to service bus to my order queue. I've already configured a connection here, but in order for this to work, the only thing I needed to do was to set this value here, this qualified namespace. And all I've given it is my service bus instance, nothing else. That's it. And the reason being that what I've done is I've granted permission for the managed identity of the Logic app access to that service bus instance. So you could apply permission to the whole namespace, or you can narrow that down to individual queues and topics, because both support using Azure AD authorization or role-based access control. So this demo that I've shown, I would say, is fairly typical for customers. They usually want to protect their resources using RBAC. The only other thing that we'd likely see is that the Logic app would have private link enabled, so that it has a private endpoint. The API management would be in a virtual network so that it could talk to the Logic app, and Service Bus would most likely have a private endpoint as well, only available in the premium tier, by the way. So that, I would say, is a typical end-to-end use case, and it's a fairly typical thing that we would recommend to customers. So I think I covered everything off there. I mean, if we get time, I could show the configuration that I've done inside Azure AD, but I'll share a link to my blog which covers that off.
Yeah, but one of the things really to just highlight on this, though, is that by the fact that we've used API management as an access point into the Logic app, and then used managed identities from API management through to Logic app through to Service Bus, it just simplifies that whole journey, because we're not having to validate and keep revalidating that access token all the time, and that makes everything so much simpler as we go through. So that, but also as Dave showed, the way that you've got the policies in API management, that's a very clear and declarative way of actually doing that check. So again, you've got a consistent way of doing your OAuth, and then from there, everything is just managed identity flowing through. Keeps it very secure, but also makes sure that you've got that really granular access to the entry point into that flow. Okay, thanks for that, Dave. What I'm going to do now is just carry on. There's a few other things there are a couple of other slides to go through, and then really we can start to conclude and go to a bit of Q&A. So talking about secret management, I mean, obviously, Logic Apps and the Visual Designer lets you configure all your connectors with login information, but that definitely isn't the best place to keep it. So you want to keep all those connection strings, passwords, usernames, keep all those secure and not keep them in your Logic App. So, and really that's one of the key, that's one of the things Key Vault's there for. So keep your secrets in Key Vault. You can access Key Vault using managed identity, and then you can just reference the particular item in Key Vault that you want when you need to pull that secret into your connector. And again, so you can connect to Key Vault directly from your applications. It's built in. Key Vault's designed so that all the different bits of Azure work with that. So, whether you're using Logic Apps, whether you're using Data Factory, whatever, just connect straight to Key Vault, and pull in the secrets from there, and then you've got them protected. And finally, this is just as a bit of a wash up about some of the other things that, and some of the things that Dave was talking about just then, is that there's, I'll just show these, and then we can just talk through them a bit. But generally speaking, not everything is securable via the Azure portal. But a lot of the key to this is to understand how app registrations work, because when you understand an app registration, who's allowed to view it, what audiences, what roles they have, how that links through onto Enter ID, that kind of makes all that thing hang together. So, but again, back to the weakest link being between the keyboard and the chair, it's really good practice to make sure that you do all your changes to infrastructure as code. So anything, particularly in your production environment, make sure all the changes are going through as infrastructure as code. Don't configure all this stuff on the fly, because it can be wrong, it can be inconsistent. It's not, you're not in a known state. So please get used to using your DevOps for the security. Another thing is that a lot of connectors can kind of expose various. I don't know I'm trying to think of the word I'd use for this, but there's a lot of connectors that, from a security perspective, you may not want to use. But what you can do is you can use Azure policy to restrict which connectors you're actually allowed to use and actually allowed to pull into your application. So do you have any other thoughts around, or any other specific examples that you'd want to highlight, Dave, around either around policy or around what you should be doing in the portal versus not, or anything else around app registrations and Enter ID?
I mean, with Azure policy, I think it's really important to understand what that can do for you, because it is able to, for example, prevent APIs being created that don't have HTTPS, for example, in the case of APIM, or in Logic Apps, you can prevent either one connector, or connector pairs from being connected, for being created, and therefore somebody being able to just use that Logic App to go and copy some data that is your corporate data. So I think Azure policy is really, really important. And just as we said before, using Azure AD and app registrations in order to facilitate fetching tokens or using managed identity is really important as well, because it is, I guess it's kind of externalizing that authorization to Azure AD so that you're not having to worry about it with storing secrets locally.
Yeah, good stuff. So again, that's a whole big topic, but feel free to reach out and talk to us about that one. So I'm just looking at the time, want to make sure we've got some time for Q&A, but let's just quickly do some of the conclusion parts of this, and then we can start getting on to your questions. So in terms of some takeaways, hang on a minute. Thanks for your question, Andy, but I'll just hide that for a second. So, just think about that shared responsibility model in that Azure provides the tools, and all these things we've talked about, they're there for you to use, but it's actually your responsibility to use them correctly. We've talked about the strength in depth, how you can add the various layers of defense so that you've actually got multiple ways of securing your applications. We've talked about the way you can use the perimeter security and API management to actually make sure that you've got a strong perimeter. We've talked about the way that private networks, private link work to keep all your traffic private and on your own network, so that when you're accessing your network resources, that none of that is being exposed to the internet. And we've talked about the fact that we can use the managed identities and flow those credentials through your application. So very quickly, just let's go back to Slido and just see if we've got, so please feel free to just add up just put one or two words to share what your thoughts on the topic, on the webinar, on security. What is it you've learned? Let's just please add a couple of words, and we'll just give you 30 seconds to do that and see what you think. No, thanks a lot for these. Keep them coming. Yeah, security is the key. And actually, once you've got the patterns, then I think the stuff is easy to secure. It's just know what those patterns are. As with anything in software, once you've got a great pattern, you can you can keep repeating that and knowing you're on strong ground. We've got another a couple of things coming in. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for sharing your thoughts on that one. Okay, I'll just give a couple of seconds, and then we'll get on to the Q&A. Right, thanks a lot for that. So without further ado, what I'll do is I will flip over onto our view here, so we can see us, and then let's have a look at. So we showed this one before, so we'll probably better get onto this. So hi Andy, do all built-in connectors support managed identity? There are so many of them.
Sorry, Andrew. Yeah, not all of them, but a whole bunch of them do. But if there's one that you need that isn't there, reach out, and we can find out what the roadmap is from the product team.
Good stuff. Thanks, Dave. And but that would be in the documentation for it, wouldn't it? So if you were looking at using a managed connector, you would sorry, if you're looking at using any particular connector, that would be in the documentation. Okay, so Dave. So whilst you can use APIM to control HTTP triggered logic out, so like we demonstrated, you put APIM in front of a logic out. If someone else is on your internal network, can you stop them from accessing that? Can you stop people from calling the logic out directly? I think is what you're saying, Dave. So I suppose part of this comes back to the managed identities thing, doesn't it? That if we've got, if you've effectively making sure that it's APIM flowing through that managed identity, and that's what's allowed to call the logic app, then if anyone else is calling it direct, they wouldn't be able to. You think of any other things you might do on that one, Dave?
I suppose it's yes, it's two things. It's the identity, but also network security. And what I didn't really show in my demo was that the JWT token that was being validated in APIM was different to the logic app. So that in my case, the client had to get a token to call APIM, but there is trust between APIM and the logic app. So APIM is the only thing that is able to call the logic app. And if I was to do IP restriction or use private endpoints, then we would further restrict that. But I think the OAuth definitely is a great way of ensuring that only the thing that you want to call your logic app is the thing that can call it.
Yeah, I can only agree. I'm just trying to get to see the next question we've got here. And this is probably I mean, we've talked very much about the kind of logic app standard type area, but Sonia's asked a question about restricting client ID's access to logic apps in the consumption plan. So I think one of the things there is that whilst in the consumption plan you're on shared compute, you can still do, you still have a lot of security tools in your box. You can still control. You still got all the role-based security. I think you can, you can still do. I think you can still control the IP addresses that are calling things. So, you got any other thoughts about what else we might use in the toolbox to control the consumption plan?
Yeah. So yeah, Sonia, you can. It's been around actually for quite a long time. The OAuth authorization in consumption is under settings and then under authorization, and you can create a policy in there that allows you to check for specific claims being available. So if you wanted to restrict to a specific client ID, then that's where you would do that, and you can put a custom claim as well. So you could put the OID claim, the object ID, or the app ID for the client ID. So you could just put those in there, and that would restrict it to the whichever client you want that to be.
Yeah, great stuff. Got another question now from Mustafa, and this is quite a long one, but so using IP whitelisting in external systems, and I think the question here seems to be talking about the fact that when Microsoft are hosting things, then obviously they're in control of the IP addresses, and those change sometimes. And so if you are whitelisting a bunch of IP addresses and then Microsoft as the host then goes and changes them. So any thoughts on actually protecting about that in an easier way? Because I have had this before. I mean, particularly with kind of a lot of Azure Data Factory, you're using shared compute and calling through into databases and whitelisting from that sort of thing, and you do have to keep on top of that. But have you got any thoughts on best practices for that, Dave?
Yeah, I think the challenge here is that this has been and I've highlighted here that the outbound IP addresses can change. And this really varies whether or not you're using the built-in connectors or whether you're using the managed connectors. But you can use a NAT gateway, which would give you a static IP outbound. I can share a link telling you how to do that. Or another thing we see, which we recommend as well, is people often think about API management as a way of managing inbound connectivity, but you can also use it for outbound. So if you've got your logic app that needs to make an outbound call, you could create an API in APIM. Its back end is that endpoint that you want to call. And APIM has a static IP, of course, in all tiers apart from the consumption tier. So if you're using standard or premium, for example, then your client could IP whitelist the static IP of APIM, and they don't need to know anything at all about your logic app.
Yeah, and I suppose, and there's a kind of a deeper architectural thing there. It's like it's going back to sort of an API-based microservices architecture. That the more the more you can make things API-based, it makes a lot of this stuff a lot easier to control. But yeah, but a good point, Dave, about using APIM not only as an ingress gateway but an egress gateway, because you can simplify a lot. Because a lot of this thing as well is not only how do you keep on top of these IP changes, but it's where is that governed and where is that configured, and generally the place where you don't want to be configuring that is in your logic app. You want somewhere in your you want to know where that one place in your infrastructure where you're going to be configuring that, whether it's your whether it's APIM or whether it's your NAT gateway. But it's like, where is the best place to administer that from an architectural point of view. Let's just have a quick scan down to see. I'm just looking through the ones that have been starred, and I think, do you know what? I think we've got through them all. So thank you so much, everyone, for your questions. I think we've got through everything, and we're going to finish on time for the first time ever. So, so thanks so much for joining us. Thanks to everyone on StreamYard. Thanks to everyone on LinkedIn, and we'll be back soon. So keep an eye out, because I think the next installment is going to talk about the DevOps and deployment side of Logic Apps, and particularly with the security hat on, there's a lot of things to bear in mind there. So, so thanks for joining us, and we will be with you next time. Thanks a lot, Dave, for as always for your expert your expert contribution there. Just absolutely fantastic hearing your depth of knowledge and the way that you approach a lot of these problems. So thanks for joining us as well. So we'll see you soon. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Bye now.
Thank you.